So another important figure to think about when we're talking about this transition from from mercantilism to capitalism is Max Weber. Weber links the rise of capitalism to technology, ideas, and beliefs, as well as the Protestant Reformation. He expresses concerns about capitalism because he thought people were becoming obsessed with working and making money, and that they would never ultimately enjoy that money. Weber linked the rise of capitalism to technology as much as ideas, specifically ideas and beliefs connected to the Protestant Reformation. He saw capitalism in a negative light, not because he thought it caused alienation like Marx did, but because he thought people became too caught up in the process. This is very, very apparent today. People get caught up making money and ultimately are never able to spend and enjoy what they've spent their entire time working for. A good example is people who work for, let's say, a factory like Ford, who ultimately could not own a Ford. Or if they could own one, they might not have the free time to enjoy it. Or someone who works their entire life, saves for retirement, and then dies either before they retire or shortly after they retire. Once again, they're not able to enjoy what they've spent their entire life working to have once they got done working. There's some recent changes in capitalism and in society today. People actually earn less money relative to the cost of living compared to the early 1900s. This is ultimately because only men were supposed to work when we originally determined these economic situations. Men ultimately were paid enough to provide for the whole family. And unfortunately, the higher wage was at the cost of women's freedom and autonomy. If you take my gender class, we get much more into this. Drawing off the same example from before, the Ford Motor Company, their idea of the family wage was based on a very limited definition of family. In the end, it favored men with children over single men or married men without children. And it reinforced the notion that women should not work at all. The fact that women have often been paid less than men has served to deter them from seeking work as a lifelong choice. And the wage structure was one factor that made women see marriage as the only way to have financial security. So you can see that the way that you structure the workplace ultimately impacts positions of authority within the family. Men are the primary caregivers. Women are the ones that are being cared for. Some other recent changes compared to other industrialized countries, as in some developing countries, Americans work longer hours and have fewer vacation benefits and less generous family leave policies. Even when generous benefits are available, workers often don't take advantage of them, which suggests that work is central to the lives of Americans. While more American companies are offering family-friendly policies such as flex time and flex space, employers are not necessarily taking advantage of them in great numbers. Arlie Hochschild suggests that there has been a reversal of sacred and profane, that people would rather be at work than at home because at least work is less chaotic. Studies show that working mothers are less depressed and have higher self-esteem than mothers who do not work, yet they are also more likely to feel tired and anxious, and they have higher divorce rates. This idea that the American lifestyle is better than everybody else's lifestyle and that God forbid we lived like those democratic socialists in Europe, where they get more vacation time, more benefits, and are required to pay less for them. Somehow it's told to us in a way that we just think that they're not doing as well as we are. Those in the United States have it better than everybody else. Well, when you look at the numbers, that's just not the case. Globalization is a relatively new concept. It's becoming old, but it's really been around only since the late 80s, early 1990s. What we're referring to here is the processes that create and intensify worldwide social exchanges and interdependencies. This creates an increase in trade and economic exchanges, and it magnifies the division between the world's rich and the poor. As I was saying, while globalization is not a new phenomenon, the current period of globalization has a number of new elements and has clearly demarcated the division between the world's rich and the world's poor. The question is whether globalization can truly be a force to close that gap, or if it serves only to widen it. Much of what we see today has been to widen it. I think, at least with the present administration, Republican Congress and Republican presidency, and if the new tax, the passage of the new tax deal has any indication, we're going to see a widening between the gap, not a shrinking of the gap between the rich and the poor. This brings us to, in my mind, one of the most important institutional structures in our society, corporation. And you have to ask yourself, because this is another one of those places where we need to dig below the surface of what we're seeing to truly understand the implications of what a corporation is. Founding fathers were very suspicious of corporations, and they did their best to regulate them. But as we've seen over time here in the United States, corporations have used the law to recreate themselves as a juristic person, or an entity that has all the legal rights, duties, and responsibilities of a person, although their primary goal is generally the pursuit of profit. As I was mentioning, corporations have many of the same rights as people. They can buy and sell property. They can be sued in court, and so on. However, corporations aren't people. You have to ask yourself, are there problems with giving corporations rights when they inherently don't have morals or ethics? Well, of course, it's an easy question to answer. As you'll see in the film, The Corporation, which you should be watching this section, it does create some problems. The Zeitgeist film structures and creates the corporation in a specific way. And it uses the DSM-4 or the DSM-5, I think that's the version that's out now, which is the manual that a psychiatrist would use to determine what type of disorder that you have if you went to a psychiatrist. And they come up with a interesting set of findings. So if there are problems with allowing individual rights to entities that inherently have no morals or ethics, and have no physical individuals to arrest and incarcerate. This is another problem with corporation. What you do is you create a shell that is the corporation, which essentially is a limited liability corporation. The people that are making the decisions for the corporation ultimately are not responsible for the decisions that the corporation makes, even though the people that are parts of the CEOs, the boards, and things like that are the ones that ultimately make the decisions. The model raises concerns about corporate ethics, environmental responsibility, fair wages, offshoring of labor and offshoring of funds. As I was mentioning, the corporation, it's going to look at this entity that we call the corporate form as a psychopath. I want you to think about that. How is the corporation a psychopath, especially in reference to corporate ethics, environmental responsibility, fair wages, and offshoring of labor? The overriding objectives of a corporation is to make profits for their shareholders. That's it. And in order to do this, they must find ways to beat the competition or to make the product cheaper than what the other person is making it for. Sometimes these efforts lead to corporations to cross the line of legality, or at least come close. There's a constant tension for corporations in terms of pressures to be environmentally responsible, which can add to the overall cost and pressures to be profitable. What I mean by this is that if an environmental regulation or the breaking of an environmental regulation costs a corporation $100,000 and a slap on the hand, yet they make $10 million from breaking the environmental regulation, then it's economically rational and reasonable for a corporation to break the regulation. The profits that they make at the expense of possibly being caught are well worth the risk. And given that set of choices, the corporation will make the same choice every time, and that is to pollute. One thing we have to do is keep in mind that fighting for workers' rights, workers sometimes need to form a union, and it's absolutely necessary for workers to collectively organize and formally unite for the purpose of collective bargaining to negotiate against these large corporations. Unions became more important as the pursuit of profit became more important for corporations. Unions traditionally helped to ensure that workers were treated fairly and that the working conditions were safe. When a company refuses to negotiate or renew a contract, this is called union busting. And you have to consider that corporations don't want unions. They do not want the labor force to be able to collectively bargain to protect themselves against the corporate form, which is then going to inherently try to reduce their amount of pay and benefits as part of the process of doing their daily work. And if you have a chance, you might take a look at the Sociology on the Street video to find out more about the rise of smartphones and what that means to companies like Apple and Samsung, who are now worth billions of dollars. How did these companies rationalize vast pay gaps between executives and their faculty retail workers? This is a common problem within the corporate world. And the video, The Corporation by Zeitgeist, will give you a real good insight into what's going on with this as well.